His grandfather counted earthworms in 1942. Nobody listened. He did. In October of 1987, on a harvested cornfield in Harlan County, Nebraska, Voss was on his knees in cold ground. He was 42 years old. He was pressing a soil probe into the earth at 3-foot intervals, along a transect line he had painted on a fence post in red, measuring from the post to the creek timber, in a straight line. He had walked so many times the grass grew differently along its path. The probe brought up a plug of dark soil 4 inches long, and Carell tipped it onto a white enamel tray and counted what moved. He wrote the number in a composition notebook, the cover worn soft as cloth. Then he moved 3 feet and pressed the probe again. The notebook was not his. The handwriting at the front of it was his grandfather's, tight and careful, dated April 1942. And the columns Carell filled every fall used the same headings Aldous Voss had printed in pencil 45 years before. Date, plot, dit, count, yield note. Carell had inherited 29 of these books when Aldous died in 1974. He had been adding to the 30th ever since. That morning, the count on the south transect came in at 31 earthworms per cubic foot of soil. Carell knew what that number meant because Aldous had explained it to him on a Saturday morning in 1968, kneeling in this same field, holding 2 fistfuls of earth, one from the home ground, one dug up the night before from Darren Salt's east field across the fence line. The difference in weight was the same as a dry towel and a wet one. "Count what's in here," Aldous had said, opening his left hand. "Then count what's in mine." That's the whole argument. Carell had been 23 that morning. He had not needed convincing. He had grown up watching his grandfather walk the fence line at first light and press a soil probe into the ground the way a doctor presses a stethoscope to a chest, not searching for trouble but listening for the baseline that would make trouble recognizable when it came. In the spring of 1942, with his 2 younger brothers newly enlisted and the farm's hired hand gone with them, Aldous found himself with 80 acres to work and no one to work it with except his wife Marta and the second-hand farm-all that burned more fuel than it should. He could not afford to farm expansively. He had to farm precisely. He began reading whatever the county library and the state agricultural extension bulletins had to offer, looking for anything that would let him do more with what he had. He found a USDA bulletin from 1938, published by a soil biologist at the University of Wisconsin, that described earthworm populations as proxy indicators of organic matter content, that a soil hosting 30 or more earthworms per cubic foot of sampled material was almost certainly retaining moisture at rates that would matter in dry periods. The bulletin cited controlled trials in Ohio and Illinois. It used numbers Aldous trusted, not claims, but measurements. He read it twice, noted the methodology in pencil in the margin, and decided to start counting. For the first 3 years, the counts were unremarkable. The 1942 and 1943 tallies averaged 12 per cubic foot, which the bulletin described as moderate. Aldous began adding compost, kitchen waste, barn bedding, the stalks from the previous season plowed in rather than burned. He stopped burning. Every neighbor in the township burned their stubble in October. The smoke hung in the air for 2 weeks every fall, and the county roads smelled of it from September through November. Aldous stopped in 1943 and did not start again. By 1947, his counts were averaging 19. By 1951, they were at 24. The soil had changed texture in a way he could feel with his hands before he ever put a probe in it. Darker, looser, with a particular give under the heel of a boot that the adjacent fields did not have. His yields were not dramatically different from his neighbors in the good years. A bushel or 2 better per acre, nothing that made anyone pay attention. The good years were good for everyone, and nobody measures the gaps in good years. They measure them in bad ones. In 1953, a county extension agent named Thaddeus Pringle visited 6 farms in Harlan County as part of a soil survey program. He came to the Voss place on the Thursday in April, walked the fields with Aldous, looked at the notebooks, and wrote a report that Aldous requested a copy of. The report described the Voss operation as tidy, and the earthworm methodology as a personal hobby not supported by current agronomic consensus. It recommended that Aldous adopt the county's standard fertility program, anhydrous ammonia at 80 pounds per acre, herbicide program as outlined, residue burning as standard practice. Aldous read the report at the kitchen table. He wrote a response in his notebook, not to Pringle, not to the extension office, to himself, or perhaps to whoever would eventually read the notebooks after him. It occupied 3 pages in his careful handwriting. The last line of those 3 pages read, "A man who does not count what is in his own ground cannot tell me what is not worth counting." He put the notebook on the shelf and went back to work. Carell had read those 3 pages many times. He knew them nearly by heart. Darren Soat had taken over his father's 160 acres in 1971, the year Carell turned 26. The Soat ground bordered the Voss South field along a fence line that had been walked, mended, and argued over by both families for 3 generations. Darren was a capable farmer, organized, well-equipped, early to adopt whatever the county extension office recommended. He put in center privet irrigation in 1973, the second in the township. He planted hybrid corn varieties released that year and achieved yields that the grain elevator posted on their chalkboard, which was a kind of public honor in Harlan County. People noticed the salt numbers in the good years. Darren noticed the Voss numbers too, or rather, he noticed the Voss methods, which he found eccentric at best and wasteful at worst. Carell spent time on tasks that produced no immediately visible result, walking transect, pressing his soil probe at 3-foot intervals, recording counts in notebooks nobody was asking to see. He did not burn his residue. He planted cover crops in the fall, cereal, rye, and hairy vetch in a mixture his grandfather had settled on in 1961, that Darren referred to as winter weeds to anyone who asked, and some who didn't. The public statement came in October of 1979 at the Alma grain elevator, where Carell had brought in the last of his corn, and Darren had arrived with a load behind him. The elevator operator was a man named Curtis Haig, who had weighed grain for both families for 15 years. 3 other farmers were waiting in line. Darren leaned against the scale platform and said, in a voice that carried that Terrell Voss was running his grandfather's dead farm like a religion, and that the county extension office had been right in 1953 when they told the old man his worm counting was a hobby and not agronomy. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has just come in from a good yield and does not expect to be contradicted. Carell was standing 8 feet away. He did not answer. He picked up the scale ticket Curtis handed him, looked at it for a moment. His south field had come in at 108 bushels per acre that year, against Darren's posted 121, and put the ticket in his coat pocket. He drove home. That evening he took Aldous' notebook for 1979 off the shelf and opened it to the yield column for the year. He noted his own number in the continuation volume. Then he set the notebook on the kitchen table and left it there, and did not look at it again until morning. He did not argue with Darren Soat. He did not correct the record at the elevator. He went to work. There was a kind of discipline in that restraint that his wife Eleanor had noticed early in their marriage and had come to understand was not stubbornness. "You're not quiet because you can't talk," she told him once, after a difficult township meeting where 3 men had dismissed his cover crop program in front of 30 others. "You're quiet because you already know how the argument ends. You're waiting for the land to say it." She was not wrong. Carell Voss had read enough of Aldous' notebooks to know that the land argued in decades, not seasons. You had to be prepared to wait for the right year. The winters in Harlan County between 1980 and 1987 were not notable years. Corn yields across the county fluctuated between 95 and 130 bushels per acre, depending on the season, and Carell's south field ran between 105 and 118, consistently above average, never so far above that it produced the kind of public number that demands an explanation. The gap between the Voss operation and its neighbors was visible in the details if you knew where to look. The dark color of the Voss soil against the pale gray tan of the surrounding fields in early April, the way his cover crop residue broke down by planting time while neighboring stubble persisted into May. The earthworm counts that it reached 27 per cubic foot by 1984, and that Carell noted in the continuation notebooks with the same quiet diligence his grandfather had brought to every entry for 29 years. He had developed his own additions to the methodology. Where Aldous had noted yield and depth, Carell added root penetration measurements. He pulled corn plants at harvest and measured how deep the roots had gone, recording them in a column Aldous had left blank. In dry years, root depth mattered. A corn plant with roots at 24 inches could reach moisture that a plant at 14 inches could not. Carell had started measuring roots in 1978 after a dry August and had not stopped. By 1984, his average root depth at the south field was 26 inches. He had not told anyone. The input costs at the Salt farm were by 1985 running approximately $145 per acre for corn production. Carell knew this, not because Darren told him, but because the figures were public enough if you paid attention. The anhydrous ammonia truck came to the Salt place twice a year. The herbicide program required 3 applications. The fuel for the center pivot ran from April through August on a meter that Curtis Haig at the elevator had once mentioned in passing as remarkable. Carell's input costs for the same crop on the same ground were running $67 per acre. He had not financed any of this. The Voss land was unencumbered. In the spring of 1985, Carell's younger son Toby, 17 years old, asked his father why they didn't burn the residue like everyone else did. It was a fair question from a boy who had grown up watching the smoke columns rise from every field in the township, except their own. Carell took him to the south field on a Saturday morning with the probe and the white enamel tray and showed him. He dug a sample from their ground. Then he walked Toby to the fence line and dug a sample from the headland of Darren Salt's east field, as close to the property line as he could go without trespassing. He set both trays on the hood of the truck in the pale April sunlight. The Voss sample held 32 earthworms, the Salt sample held 4. The worms eat the residue, Carell said. Then they eat each other's castings. Then the corn eats that. He paused. That's the whole argument. He had used his grandfather's exact words. He had not planned to. Toby helped with the counts that fall. He did not ask to stop. In late April of 1986, Carell sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with the continuation notebook in the oldest of Aldous' composition books, the one dated spring 1942. He had been going back to the early notebooks more often that winter, not for the numbers which he knew, but for the observations Aldous had written between the columns. The notes were not systematic the way the counts were. They were observations, sometimes a single sentence, about what the soil looked like in different conditions, about what the fields of neighbors who had later gone under had looked like the spring before they failed. There was an entry from August of 1953, 2 months after Thaddeus Pringle had written his report, that Carell had read before but had not read in this context. It was brief. Aldous had written, "A dry year does not kill a farm. It reveals one. What is already thin becomes visible. What has been built stays. The next dry year will not be chosen. It will come when it comes and find what is here." Carell read it again. He was 50 years old that April, and the winter had been dry, and the extended forecast from the National Weather Service was not comfortable reading. He understood, reading that passage again, that Aldous had not been keeping those notebooks for himself. He had been writing them forward. Every observation, every count, every careful note in the margins had been addressed to whoever would be sitting at this kitchen table when the next test arrived. The notebooks were not records of the past. They were preparation for a future Aldous would not live to see. Carell sat at the table for a long time after that. Outside, the yard light threw a yellow circle on the snow that had not melted since February. The notebooks were stacked beside his coffee cup. 29 of Aldous' and 12 of his own, the 41st year of a continuous record. He opened the continuation notebook and wrote the date. Then he wrote, "The count at the South Transect last October was 31 per cubic foot. Root depth at harvest was 27 inches at the south field average. Input cost per acre, corn, was $63. If what is coming is what the notebook says to expect, the ground is ready." He closed the notebook and went to bed. The spring of 1988 arrived, with less moisture in the Harlan County soil profile than any spring since 1934. The subsoil readings at the County Extension Office, published in their April bulletin, showed an average of 40% of normal moisture content at the 12-inch depth. The water table across the Republican River drainage had dropped 3 feet over the previous 18 months. The center pivot operators were already planning for additional pumping hours. The fuel supplier in Alma ran out of diesel during the first week of April and had to order emergency resupply from a distributor in Grand Island. Taro, planted on May 9, 2 days after the frost date, into ground that felt different than it had in previous springs, drier at the surface, but not at depth. At 20 inches, the probe came back from the south field with soil that still had color in it, still held together in a ribbon between his fingers rather than crumbling. The earthworms had been working the Voss ground for 46 years. Their channels ran through the profile like a slow irrigation system, microscopic but continuous, moving moisture down in wet years, holding it in the structure of the organic matter in dry ones. He planted at 32,000 seeds per acre, 2,000 fewer than his standard rate, which was a decision he had made in March, based on nothing more mystical than a calculation. In a stress year, fewer plants competing for the same moisture would each do more. It was the same calculation Aldous had described in a notebook entry from the dry summer of 1956, when he had thinned his corn stand by hand in late May, and the neighbors had thought he was losing his mind. The 1956 yield in the Aldous notebooks was 43 bushels per acre. The county average that year had been 17. June was dry, July was catastrophic. By the third week of July, the soil moisture at the surface across most of Harlan County was effectively zero. The county extension agent, a younger man now, not Thaddeus Pringle, who had been retired for 15 years, issued a report estimating county average corn yield at between 20 and 30 bushels per acre, down from the prior year's 118. He said in the Alma Bulletin, the local paper, that he had not seen conditions like this since he had read about 1934 in his father's letters. At the Salt Farm, the center pivot ran 18 hours a day throughout July, pulling water from a well that was dropping measurably. The fuel costs for July alone at the Salt operation were, by a calculation Carell made, based on equipment size and pump depth and hours of operation, somewhere between $4,800 and $5,400 for the month. The Salt corn was visible from the county road, and what was visible was not good. The leaves had begun to roll by the second week of July, a sign of moisture stress that, in that heat, did not reverse once it started. Carroll ran no irrigation. He had no irrigation system to run. He walked the south field on the evening of the 22nd of July, after the air temperature had finally dropped below 90 for the first time in 11 days. He pulled a plant from the middle of a row and washed the roots at the hydrant by the barn. The root depth was 21 inches. Reduced from the previous fall's measurements, the moisture stress had taken something, but at 21 inches, those roots were reaching a layer of soil that had never been broken down by fuel-dependent tillage, that had been fed by the castings of earthworms for 4 decades that held water in its structure rather than just in its pores. The plants were not fine, but they were standing. He walked back into the house and opened the notebook and wrote, "The 22nd of July, 1988. Plant standing, rolling in the afternoon heat, recovering at night. Root depth at measured pull, 21 inches. County average per extension estimate approximately 15 inches. The ground is doing what the ground was built to do. He ate supper. He slept. Harvest came in October, cold and bright. The sky, the particular hard blue that arrives over the Nebraska plains when summer finally releases its grip. Carell combined a south field first. The yield monitor, he had added a basic one to the combine in 1986, showed numbers that made him stop the machine twice to check that it was calibrated correctly. The south field came in at 51 bushels per acre. The county average for 1988, published in the Extension Bulletin that December, was 14 bushels per acre, the worst since modern record-keeping began. Darren Salt's corn, by the account of Curtis Haig at the grain elevator, who told anyone who asked, because in a small county certain numbers become common knowledge whether anyone intends them to or not, had come in at 9 bushels per acre. The center pivot water and the fuel costs and the input program had not been enough. The soil had not had the structure to hold what the pivot delivered. The investment had been real. The machinery was real, the effort was real, and the harvest was 9 bushels. Carell hauled his grain to the elevator in 3 loads across 2 days. He did not post the number on any board. He did not mention it to Curtis Haig beyond the necessary exchange of scale tickets. He drove home each time and wrote the daily total in the notebook. On the second day of hauling, Lena Brower arrived. She was a soil researcher from the University of Nebraska, 37 years old, who had been flagged by the State Extension Office after the 1988 harvest reports showed a yield anomaly at the Voss property in Harlan County. In a county of 14 bushel average yields of field, coming in at 51 bushels was not a number that stayed quiet. She had driven 3 hours from Lincoln with a soil sampling kit and a list of questions she was prepared to have answered defensively. She found Carell sitting on the tailgate of the combine header trailer eating a sandwich. She introduced herself. She asked if she could take soil samples. Carell said yes and finished his sandwich. She spent 4 hours in the south field. She took samples at 10-inch depth, 20-inch depth, and 30-inch depth along 3 transects. She pulled plants at 2 locations and measured root structure. She came back to the barn with her sample bags labeled and her field notes full, and a look on her face that Carell had seen before a few times. The look of someone who has just been shown a number that does not fit their prior understanding of a situation. She asked Carell how long the field had been managed the way it was currently managed. He brought her inside and showed her the notebooks. She sat at the kitchen table for nearly 2 hours, working through them from 1942 forward, stopping to make notes of her own. When she reached the August 1953 entry, Aldous' response to Pringle's dismissal, the 3 pages, the final line, she read it slowly. She read it again. She looked up. "Did he ever send this to the Extension Office?" she asked. "No," Carell said. He wrote it for himself. Lena Brower went back to Lincoln with 18 soil sample bags and the knowledge that the Voss South Field had been under continuous biological management since 1942. She sent the samples to the university's soil testing laboratory. The results came back in November. The organic matter content of the Voss South Field at the 10-inch depth was 6.2%. The county average, pulled from extension records for Harlan County, was 1.8%. The water holding capacity at the 20-inch depth was calculated at 2.4 inches of available water per degree Fahrenheit oot of soil. The county average was 0.9 inches. She called Carell from her office in Lincoln. She read him the numbers. There was a silence on the line. "Your grandfather's counts," she said. "The earthworm counts from 1942 through 1971. "Yes," Carell said. "They track exactly with the organic matter buildup. 31 earthworms per cubic foot at the time of his death. I've never seen field records like these. Has anyone else seen them?" "The county extension office saw them in 1953, Carell said. "They said it was a hobby." Another silence. "I'd like to write about this," Lena Brower said. "With your permission?" "Yes," Carell said. 2 weeks after Lena Brower's call on a Thursday morning in late November, Carroll was in the barn organizing the seed selection for next year's planting when he heard a truck pull into the driveway. He did not look up immediately. He finished the row he was sorting before walking to the barn door. Darren Salt's pickup was parked at the edge of the gravel, the engine off, Darren sitting in the cab with the window down. He had his hat in his lap. Carroll walked to the truck and stopped near the driver's door. Darren did not speak for a moment. He looked at the field beyond the barn, the stubble rows still visible in the thin November light, the dark color of the turned soil at the field's edge, where Carroll had begun his fall preparation. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has been looking at for years and is only now actually seeing. 9 bushels, Darren said finally. Carroll did not say anything. I had the pivot running 18 hours a day in July. Diesel, water, the whole program. Darren turned his hat in his hands. 9 bushels, I know, Carroll said. I watched your field come in. I watched Curtis weigh it. Darren's jaw worked for a moment. 51 bushels on ground with no irrigation. No pivot, no anhydrous, no. He stopped. How? It was not quite a question. It was the beginning of a different kind of listening. Carroll leaned against the truck door. He was not in a hurry. Come in the morning, he said. Saturday. I'll show you what the soil looks like at depth. I'll show you the notebooks. He paused. The numbers go back to 1942. It's not complicated. It just takes a long time. Darren looked at him. His expression held several things at once. The residue of the years of dismissal, the weight of the 1988 season, the specific arithmetic of 9 bushels against 51. He was not a man who apologized easily or often. He did not apologize. Saturday, he said. He put the truck in reverse and backed down the driveway, and Carroll stood in the gravel and watched him go. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel. He felt, instead, something he recognized from the notebooks. The particular quiet that follows the moment when a long argument is finally resolved, not by persuasion, but by evidence. Aldous had described it in a note from 1957 after a neighbor had come to ask about the cover crop program for the first time after years of public skepticism. It is not satisfaction, Aldous had written. It is the end of waiting. Carroll went back to the barn and finished sorting his seed. Lena Brower's paper, Soil Biological Activity and Drought Resilience in Non-Irrigated Corn Production, a 46-case study from Harlan County, Nebraska, was submitted to the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in February 1989 and published that summer. It was 41 pages. The abstract described the Voss South field as showing exceptional long-term organic matter accumulation and moisture retention capacity attributable to consistent biological management documented in continuous farm records from 1942 to the present. The word exceptional was hers. The data was Aldous'. The paper included, with Carroll's permission, a photograph of 4 of Aldous' composition notebooks laid open on the kitchen table, showing the earthworm count columns from 1942, 1951, 1971, and 1971. It was the first time those numbers had appeared anywhere outside the Voss kitchen. The paper was cited by a USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service report the following year. It was mentioned in a Successful Farming magazine article in 1990 and in a University of Nebraska Extension Bulletin in 1991. Darren Salt attended the 1990 Extension meeting where the bulletin was presented by a county agent who used the Voss farm as the lead example. He sat in the 3rd row and did not say anything. Afterward, he shook the county agent's hand and drove home. He was not farming his east field the same way he had farmed it in 1987. He had not burned his residue the previous fall. He had asked Carroll, on that Saturday morning in November 1988, for the name of the hairy vetch seed supplier. Carroll had given it to him. By 1993, 5 years after the drought, Darren Salt's earthworm counts on his east field. He had started keeping them using the methodology in Aldous' notebooks, which Carell had let him copy by hand on that first Saturday, were averaging 11 per cubic foot. It was not 31, but it was not 4 either. It was a beginning. The Voss land itself had not been sold in any of the years when land prices had moved in ways that made selling seem reasonable. In 1981, when interest rates hit 18% and a third of Harlan County's farms changed hands in a single year, 3 men had approached Carell at various points to discuss the Voss 80. He had declined all 3 without asking for their offer numbers. In 1985, when commodity prices crashed and the Farm Aid concert was being organized in the same month that the county sheriff served foreclosure papers on 2 farms visible from the Voss mailbox, nobody asked again. By then, it was understood that the Voss land was not available. The land was 80 acres, unencumbered. It had been in the family since Aldous' father had broken it in 1918. It would continue to be in the family. Carell understood this, not as sentiment, but as obligation. The same obligation Aldous had written about in his notebook in 1953, the straight line. What had been built straight could not be bent through carelessness. In the summer of 1995, Carell's daughter-in-law brought her daughter Petra, 11 years old, Toby's child, to the farm for 2 weeks in June. Petra was a serious girl with her grandfather's habit of looking at things twice before deciding she had seen them. She had been there before for holidays, but this was the first summer she had come to work rather than visit. On the 3rd morning, Carell took her to the south field with a soil probe and the white enamel tray. He had done this before. He had done it with Toby in 1985, and he had done it with Aldous in 1968, and Aldous had done it with him in 1968, in what felt at the time like an ordinary Saturday, but revealed itself over the following decades as the hinge on which the rest of his life had turned. The ritual was not designed to impress. It was designed to transfer. He pressed the probe into the south field at the first transect mark. He tipped the plug onto the tray. He handed the tray to Petra. "Count what moves," he said. She counted carefully, her lips moving slightly. She looked up. 28, she said. "Write it down," Carell said, and handed her the notebook. She wrote the date, the plot number, the depth, and 28. In the column with the heading County, the same heading Aldous had printed in pencil in 1942 in the first of 29 composition books. Her handwriting was not her great-great-grandfather's, but it was in the same column, on the same land, making the same record that 53 years of continuous observation had been making since before she was born. She looked at the tray again, at the slow movement of the earthworms across the white enamel. "What happens to them when you till?" she asked. Carell looked at her. He had not told her not to till. He had shown her the counts. She had asked the right question on her own. "They leave," he said, "or they don't survive. And then the number goes down." He pointed across the fence line to Darren Salt's east field, visible from where they stood. The soil there paler than the Voss ground, lighter in color and texture. That field had 4 in 1985. It has 11 now. He paused. "Your great-great-grandfather started with 12 in 1942. Petra looked at the Salt field, then back at the tray. She was processing the arithmetic of it. 11 years of changed practice getting from 4 to 11. 53 years of consistent practice getting from 12 to 28. The math was slow. It required patience she was not yet sure she had, but she wrote it in the notebook and did not ask to stop. That afternoon, Carell gave her the first of Aldous' composition books. He did not make a ceremony of it. He handed it to her across the kitchen table and said, "Start from the beginning. Ask me what you don't understand." She opened it to the first page. She read for 2 hours without looking up. The notebooks would not leave the farm. They were not a gift in the ordinary sense. They were a responsibility passed to a person who had asked the right question in the south field that morning and had not needed to be told what it meant. Aldous had kept them for 29 years. Carell had continued them for 21 more. The record was 50 years of continuous observation on a single piece of ground, and it was not finished. The south field, that June afternoon, was in full summer growth, corn at knee-height, the rows dark with the particular health that comes not from inputs applied this season, but from structure built over decades. The soil at the surface was the color of good chocolate cake. The worms were in it, the roots were going down, the notes were being written. The Republican River drainage ran a quarter-mile to the east, as it had run since before the first person walked into that hollow. The fence line between the Voss land and the Salt land was a thread of rusted wire and cedar posts, leaning slightly in places, mended in others. The posts worn at the height where a man's hand rests when he stops to look over at a neighbor's field. That fence line had been the border of an argument for 40 years. The argument was over. The fence remained. What Aldous Voss had begun in the spring of 1942, kneeling in cold ground, counting what moved in a plug of dark soil, writing the number in a column he had made himself because no column existed yet, was still being counted by his grandson's hands, and now perhaps by his grandson's granddaughter's hands, in the same field, in the same columns, moving forward into seasons that had not yet arrived. That is what ignored knowledge looks like when it is finally, completely proven, not a ceremony, not a speech. A girl sitting at a kitchen table reading a notebook written before her grandfather was born, asking no one in particular why it took so long for anyone to listen. Have you ever held onto something long after everyone around you said it wasn't worth keeping, and turned out to be the only one in the room who was right?